Hello, and welcome back to Idea Way. I'm Hayden, and this episode's main topic is about time. And I don't mean like time management in the usual sense of the word, like calendars or a schedule or whatever. I mean something bigger than that. The actual amount of life you have, how much of it is genuinely yours, how much of it you give it away, and how often we put off the things that actually matter to us because we assume there's going to be like a calmer, better moment to do these things later down the road. The person I want to spend time today on this subject is Seneca. Seneca was a Roman philosopher, a statesman, and personally, I think one of the most interesting and complicated figures in the history of Stoicism as a whole. Now Seneca lived almost 2,000 years ago, but reading his essays feels strange because the problems he's describing are completely modern. People who are constantly busy but never satisfied. People who spend their whole lives preparing to live instead of actually living. People who chase money and status and power and then discover that none of it actually matters in the long run. Ultimately, though, Seneca's essays and writings all circle back to one sort of central idea. And it's the idea I want to build this entire episode around. Life isn't necessarily too short. We just lose enormous amounts of it. We hand it over to people who don't deserve it. We fill it with obligations that we never fully choose for ourselves. We spend it worrying about things that haven't happened yet and then replaying things that we can't change anymore. Then, after years of all that, we look up and wonder where it all went. That's the entire argument of his essay on the shortness of life. And it starts with an observation that I think is just honestly one of the smartest things that I've read from Seneca. Seneca points out that people get furious if someone takes even a small amount of their money. They'll fight over it, sue for it, but they let other people take up hours and days and years of their actual life without putting up much resistance at all. And when you sit with that idea for a second, it's really strange because money can be pretty easily earned again. Time can't. You can lose money and rebuild money. You can lose your reputation and rebuild your reputation. You can even lose an opportunity and sometimes another one can come along that's the same or better. But an afternoon that's gone is gone forever. There's no bank account somewhere holding your unused hours for you. There's no way to go back and recover the years you spent distracted or just living according to someone else's priorities. Seneca isn't saying that every single moment has to be maximally productive for you. He's just saying that every moment is expensive, whether you treat it that way or not. And most of us walk around treating time like it's free. Now, here's something that I think makes Seneca more interesting than most philosophers you'd read in some sort of philosophy class. And it's one of the big things that I kept running into while researching for this episode, and honestly, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. Seneca wasn't writing his essays from some quiet, peaceful life off in the countryside, totally removed from like ambition, politics, the ideas of Rome. He was almost as close to the center of power as a person could get to in ancient Rome. He was born in a city called Corduba, which is now in Spain, and was brought to Rome as a child. He gained fame in Rome because of his sharp speaking skills and his writing, got pulled into public life, and eventually ended up deep inside the imperial court as a statesman. And his political career was dangerous. Under the Emperor Claudius, he was accused of being involved in some scandal and got exiled to the island of Corsica for years before he was finally sent back to Rome and given the job of tutoring the future emperor, who was Nero. When Nero actually took power as emperor, Seneca became one of his closest advisors, which puts him in this almost impossible position. Seneca's a philosopher writing about restraint and self-control while advising one of the most infamous rulers in history. He's writing essays about the dangers of wealth while becoming extremely wealthy himself. He's warning everyone else about the corrupting nature of ambition, but he lives right at the center of a system built entirely on ambition, status, and survival. Eventually, his relationship with Nero fell apart. Seneca tried to step back from public life and put some distance between himself and the court of Rome. And later, Nero accused him of being involved in a conspiracy against him and ordered him to take his own life, which Seneca did, according to most accounts, trying to remain composed and accept this death which he couldn't avoid the way that his own philosophy had told him to. So here's the question that I think anyone reading Seneca for the first time has to ask. And it's a question that I genuinely sat with for a while before this episode. Was he a hypocrite? How do you write about simplicity while owning that much? How do you preach virtue while staying close to a man like Nero? How does a philosopher who clearly understood the dangers of power keep participating in that exact system anyways? And those are fair questions, I think. And I don't think the honest answer is that Seneca was secretly a perfect, enlightened dude who just got unlucky. He wasn't. Seneca was ambitious. He was politically involved. He benefited enormously from being close to power. And at several points, he almost certainly compromised in ways that are hard to fully defend under his philosophy. But I think actually the contradiction is part of what makes his writing worth reading rather than something that disqualifies his philosophy. Seneca wasn't writing as someone who'd escaped every temptation and was now reporting back from some peaceful state of nirvana. He was writing from inside the exact mess he was warning everyone else about. His letters often read less like a flawless teacher lecturing from above and more like a guy who constantly had to remind himself of something that he keeps forgetting. He knew what ambition felt like because he had it. He knew the particular anxiety that comes with wealth because he had wealth. He knew how dangerous power could become because he was close enough to watch it turn on people and eventually turn on him. This means that his philosophy didn't come from outside of struggle. It came from right in the middle of it. And that's a different kind of writing than simple motivational advice that you see in these pamphlets. He's not telling you that wisdom makes life easy. He's showing you that even someone who fully understands the problem can still get pulled into it. Knowing an idea is not the same as living it, which is actually a theme that I think is central to this podcast. Ray Dalio could build an entire system around principles and reflection and still get blindsided by a huge mistake. Andy Grove could design organizations meant to catch change early and still face real uncertainty about whether Intel could survive. An idea doesn't remove the work of actually applying it. It just gives you a slightly better way to see the work that's in front of you. And what Seneca gives us more than anything is a better way to see time. One of the strongest threads running through On the Shortness of Life is his attack on busyness specifically. He describes people whose schedules are packed completely full, but whose actual lives feel empty. They wake up behind, they rush from one obligation to the next, they sit in meetings, manage other people's problems, maintain appearances, chase favors, respond to what feels urgent to their job, and then collapse at the end of the day feeling completely exhausted, and they call that productive life. Seneca's response would be that a lot of these people aren't actually living busy lives, they're just occupied. And that distinction between busy and occupied matters incredibly. You can be active without ever actually directing your own life. Your time is being used constantly, but it's not being used by you. You're responding to messages, responding to expectations, responding to whatever seems most urgent in a given moment. There's a ton of motion in your life, but there's no direction. And honestly, I think that idea of motion without direction feels even more true now than it did in ancient Rome. We built entire systems designed to let other people reach us constantly. Every notification is a tiny claim on your attention. Every app is engineered to make leaving slightly harder than staying. Every unanswered text creates this background hum of obligation to answer. We're rarely doing nothing. But Seneca's question wouldn't be whether you're doing something. It would be whether you're doing something that actually matters to you. There's a difference between a life filled with activity and a life filled with intention. A packed calendar doesn't prove that your time is valuable. It just proves that you've let everyone decide what your time is for. I want to be clear that this isn't Seneca arguing for irresponsibility. He had enormous responsibilities himself. His point is just that those responsibilities should be chosen as consciously as possible. You should actually know what you're handing your life over to, because That's really what a schedule is. It's not just a list of tasks for a day. It's a record of what gets pieces of your life, of your time. When you say yes to something on your schedule, you're not just like adding something to this list. You're trading away a part of a limited, non-renewable resource in your life for it. I mean, to be honest, that sounds dramatic when you say it out loud, but it's literally true. It's a fact. And Seneca's whole point is that we should be more selective about it. Not selfish, just selective. Friendship deserves your time. Meaningful work deserves your time. Rest deserves your time. Learning deserves your time. Even entertainment deserves your time when it's something you genuinely chose rather than something you fell into. The problem isn't that every moment has to be serious and important. The problem is unconscious spending. The hours that disappear without a decision ever actually being made. You sit down for a second on TikTok and somehow an entire hour is gone scrolling. You say yes to something because saying no feels socially irresponsible. And here's something else about this that I think is insightful from Seneca, something I kept underlining or highlighting whenever I read his essays or his letters. Seneca thought that people sometimes hide inside busyness on purpose, even if they don't fully realize they're doing it. Silence is uncomfortable because it removes distraction, and when nothing urgent is happening, the bigger questions start to surface. Do I actually like the direction my life is moving in? Are these goals even mine, or did I just absorb them from somewhere? Would I actually choose this exact routine if nobody else could see me doing it? Am I building the life I actually want, or just one that looks impressive from a distance? Busyness can delay those questions almost indefinitely. It just can't ever answer them. This connects to another major thread in his writing, which is about people who are constantly preparing to live instead of actually living. He describes this pattern over and over. People tell themselves they'll start living after the next achievement, after they make enough money, after they reach a certain position, after this difficult stretch finally ends, after graduation, after a promotion, after business finally stabilizes, after everyone stops needing something from them. Then they'll read more, they'll spend time with the people they care about, then they'll take their health seriously, then they'll be calm, then they'll figure out who they actually are. The problem is that the future keeps moving the goalposts on you. Every achievement just creates a new condition. You get the thing that you wanted, and almost instantly it becomes the new normal. Your mind adjusts to it. The finish line slides further out. The waiting just continues under a different name. Seneca watched people in the Senate reach old age while they were still technically preparing to begin their lives. And that might be one of the more unsettling ideas in everything that he wrote. Not death itself, the possibility of reaching the very end and realizing you spent the whole time getting ready, always organizing, planning, always making sacrifices for some future version of your life that never actually happened. Now, I don't think that this idea means that long-term planning is some kind of mistake. And I want to be careful here because a lot of people we've talked about on this podcast built their whole approach around long timelines. Phil Knight endured decades of uncertainty while building Nike. Jeff Bezos invested in systems that took years before they paid off. Naval Ravikant talks constantly about playing the long games. James Clear's entire framework is built on the idea that small habits compound slowly over years. Seneca isn't arguing against patience or sacrifice or delayed gratification. He's asking something more specific. Has the future become an excuse to abandon the present completely? Because there's a difference between investing in the future and refusing to actually live until that future shows up. A person can work incredibly hard towards a long-term goal and still stay present along the way. They can enjoy the process itself. They can hold on to their relationships. They can notice the life that's still happening around the work. The dangerous version of this mindset is the one where the current stage only counts because it leads somewhere else. School only matters because it leads to college. College only matters because it leads to a job. The job only matters because it leads to money. The money only matters because some way it'll create happiness or freedom. And then years later, the person finally arrives at that freedom and realizes they never learned how to use it. They only ever learned how to chase the next state. This connects pretty directly to how Seneca thought about wealth, which is a topic I went back and forth a lot. while putting this episode together, because his relationship with money is complicated. He had a lot of it, and maybe that's why his observations about it land the way that they do. He never argued that money was automatically evil. Stoic philosophy in general treats wealth as something you can prefer to have without letting it define your character. Money can make life easier in measurable ways. It creates freedom, security, opportunity. The danger philosophically with money starts the moment that money stops being a tool and starts being the actual measurement of who you are. Seneca believed that poverty isn't really about how little you have. A person can own an enormous amount and still be impoverished if their desires keep expanding faster than their income does. And that's part of why some people have become more anxious as they become more successful, not less. Now they have more to maintain, more to compare themselves to, more to lose. Their lifestyle keeps growing along with their expectations, and so does their fear of it all disappearing. To deal with that, Seneca actually recommended occasionally practicing discomfort on purpose, eating very simple food for a stretch, wearing basic clothing, putting yourself below your normal standard of living for a while, and asking yourself honestly whether it was actually as bad as you thought it would be. This wasn't about romanticizing being in poverty or performing humility for some sort of audience. It was more of like a psychological drill. A lot of our fear is built entirely out of our own imaginations, and you become afraid of losing comfort just because comfort has become unfamiliar to live without. But by stepping away from this comfort voluntarily every so often, you can prove to yourself that your identity can actually survive the loss of comfort. You discover that you need a lot less than your anxiety has been telling you, and that creates a new kind of freedom. Not a freedom that comes from having everything, a freedom that's not being controlled by your fear of losing money. This idea actually lines up really close to something that Naval Ravikant talks about, which is the difference between wealth and status. Wealth creates options for you. Status mostly creates comparison with other people. And Seneca would probably agree that somebody trapped inside of a comparison game can never actually finish, because there's always going to be someone more rich, more admired, more powerful, more connected than you. If your sense of having enough depends on constantly outranking everyone around you, peace just isn't possible. There's no ending to that game. And even when you're winning it, you have to keep defending your position every single day. Seneca's alternative to all of that isn't laziness, though. It's enough. Actually knowing what enough means specifically for you. And I'd argue that might be one of the most hard forms of intelligence to find, because almost every system around us is built to make you feel like you don't have enough yet. Advertising runs on desire, status runs on comparison, even ambition itself can quietly convince you that the version of yourself that you are right now isn't acceptable yet. Seneca's underlying question is whether you can actually improve your life without treating your present self as worthless. Can you pursue something better without turning every past achievement into proof that you were not enough before? Can you own things without those things owning your attention? And I think that's a much harder balance to strike than simply rejecting money or simply chasing it without a limit. Another major piece of Seneca's writing that I found useful is his work on anger, which he wrote about extensively in a piece literally called On Anger. He saw anger not as strength, but as a kind of temporary madness. When people get angry, their judgment narrows almost immediately. They stop asking what response would actually produce the best outcome for them and start wanting punishment instead. They want the other person to feel pain. They want reality itself to acknowledge they were wronged. And to be fair, sometimes anger is completely understandable. People really do get treated unfairly. They're embarrassed, they're betrayed, they're ignored, they're attacked. Seneca doesn't deny any of that. His concern is specifically about what the anger does to the person feeling it, regardless of whether it's justified or not. Anger usually starts as a demand that reality should have gone differently, that one person shouldn't have said that the plan shouldn't have failed, the traffic shouldn't be this bad, the market shouldn't move like that. Sometimes those unfair judgments are even correct. The event really was unfair, but getting angry doesn't reverse anything that already happened. It just creates a new problem on top of the first one. You lose control over your own response, which is often the only part of the situation that you can control yourself in the first place. This connects directly to Marcus Aurelius, who emphasized that external events and other people's actions don't actually belong to us. Only our own judgment and conduct do. Seneca is making a similar point, but he's specifically interested in the emotional escalation that anger creates. Anger makes urgency. It tells you that you have to act right now. Send a message, say a thing, make an accusation. But the actions that you take in a state of anger usually create consequences that outlast the feeling of anger itself by a lot. Seneca believed that delay was one of the best treatments available for anger. Don't react while the emotion is at its peak. Create some space. Let your interpretation of the situation cool off before you act in anger. Ask people who were there what actually happened, instead of just accepting whatever story your anger, your emotions are currently telling you. It's not just about suppressing emotion or pretending you don't feel anger. It's about refusing to give that emotion authority over your decisions. I think this connects in a pretty direct way to both Grove and Dallio, actually, which surprised me when I was still researching. Grove wanted organizations to confront reality honestly instead of reacting defensively the second that bad news showed up. Dallio wanted painful experiences to turn into a reflection instead of ego protection. Seneca would say that anger is exactly the thing that interrupts both of these processes before they can even start. When ego feels threatened, it wants to defend itself before it even fully understands what's happening. A piece of criticism is disrespect. A disagreement is betrayal. A mistake is someone else's fault. You end up losing the actual information because you're too busy fighting the feeling that came with it. Another idea that stuck with me from Seneca's writing is what he says about anticipatory suffering. This idea that we tend to experience painful events once in reality and many more times in our own imagination. You worry about failing before you even attempted the thing you might fail at. You imagine humiliation before a conversation you've even had yet. And sometimes the thing you feared never even shows up. You've still paid the emotional cost for it anyways. Other times it does happen, and now you've paid for it twice. Once in anticipation, and once in reality. Seneca isn't saying preparation is useless here, to be clear. Some anxiety actually contains useful information. It can warn you to study harder, to save more money, to have a difficult conversation you've been avoiding, to steer away from a reckless decision. The problem is just when thinking stops producing any actual preparation and just starts producing repetition instead. At that point, you're not solving anything anymore. You're rehearsing this pain for no reason. And that's an easy mindset to fall into in this world, I think, because worrying feels active. It feels like you're actually doing something to stop this worrying, to stop this uncertainty. But most of the time, you're really just experiencing that uncertainty more intensely than you actually need to. Seneca's actual approach was to bring the fear into clearer focus instead of letting it stay vague. What exactly are you afraid will happen? If it actually happens, what would you do next? What part of it would still be bad? What part of your mind is exaggerating? And what is in your control right now? The goal isn't to guarantee that nothing bad will ever happen to you. The goal is to make the fear specific enough to actually examine. Vague fear grows on its own. It rephrases itself to any situation. Specific fear can be looked at directly, and often when you look at it directly, you find out one of a few things. Maybe the possibility is real and it requires some kind of action. Okay, just do it. Stop this fear. Maybe the worst case outcome would be hard but survivable. Or maybe, and this happened a lot in his writing, you discover that you're mostly afraid of embarrassment or of losing status or of what some other person might think of you. Seneca was especially cautious of that last category, fear based purely on reputation. He thought that people allowed an imagined audience way too much control over very real decisions. They avoid necessary action because of what others might think. They stay in situations they actually hate because leaving would require some kind of explanation. The end result is a life that's governed by these spectators. And Seneca's response to that was to ask how much power you really want to hand over to people who, in most cases, are barely thinking about you at all. Most people are completely absorbed in their own lives. The judgment you're so afraid of might last seconds or minutes in someone else's head and several years in yours. And it's a terrible time trade when you lay it out like that. There's also this piece of his thinking about adversity, which I think connects everything we've talked about today together. Seneca believed that hardship reveals who you actually are in a way comfort never can, because comfort doesn't demand enough from you to expose your weaknesses. You might believe that you're a patient person right up until you're actually forced to wait for something. You might think that you're humble right until someone criticizes you. You might think that you're calm until you actually lose control of the situation. Adversity is what shows you the gap between the version of yourself you imagine and the version of yourself you actually are, or you practice being. And to be clear, this doesn't mean that Seneca thought that suffering was just a good thing all in all, or that people should go looking for a tragedy. He's saying that once a hardship exists, whether you wanted it to or not, it can actually be used for something. That idea connects perfectly to Dallio's equation from a couple episodes back. Pain plus reflection equals progress. Seneca would probably second that, although I think he'd add that pain doesn't just give you information about the world around you, it gives you information about yourself specifically. What happens when the plan fails? What happens when someone else gets recognition that you wanted? What happens when your identity gets challenged directly? These moments are basically diagnostic tests. They reveal the actual habits that sit underneath whatever image that you've built of yourself in your head. I also wanted to talk about how Seneca thought about death, because this was honestly a part of his writing that I expected to find depressing or boring almost going in, and ended up finding the most clarifying out of all of his writing instead. A lot of modern conversation avoids the topic of death entirely unless something forces it into the conversation. Seneca did the exact opposite. He thought about it constantly and deliberately, not because he was obsessed with misery, but because he believed that death clarifies time better than almost anything else can. When people quietly assume that their life is going to continue indefinitely, they delay things. They tolerate routines that don't mean anything to them. They put off difficult decisions. They assume broken relationships can be repaired later. They convince themselves that the work that they actually care about can wait until all the practical things you have to do are finally cleared out of the way. But those things you have to do never actually finish. There's always one more. Remembering that life is limited, that death exists, interrupts that illusion. It forces the question of whether the way that you're currently spending your time actually makes sense, given that time itself is finite. And to be clear, this isn't an argument for abandoning responsibility and acting recklessly. If anything, someone who genuinely keeps death in view should probably become more responsible, not less. Promises matter more because the time you have to keep them is limited. Relationships matter more because every single conversation is part of a finite number of conversations you have. Meaningful work matters more when it actually contributes to something real. And maybe most usefully, arguments and conflicts become much easier to just let go of. How many hours of a genuinely limited life are worth spending resentful of someone? How much of that time should go to a comment made by a person whose opinion you don't even respect? Seneca believed that someone who has actually learned how to live has also learned how to die. And that doesn't mean wanting it. It just means that you no longer let the fear of it quietly run every decision you make. I want to close on something that Seneca writes about that doesn't get talked about that much, which is friendship and what he calls the inner life. His letters to Lucilius are written as advice to an actual friend, even though that's pretty clear he intended them for a much wider audience too. And I think that the format matters more than it seems at first. Seneca never presents his philosophy as some private, solitary enlightenment, deliberation in private. He presents it as a conversation. A real friend helps you think more clearly. A real friend can point out exactly where your behavior doesn't match the values you claim to hold, and can do it honestly without just being someone who's judging you. This connects in an interesting way to both Dallio's radical transparency, and Grove's idea of constructive confrontation. All three of them, in their very own different contexts, understood that people genuinely need honest information from outside their own heads. But friendship adds something those business frameworks don't quite get. The goal isn't just better performance, it's actually being known by another person. You can build a life that looks completely successful from the outside while being emotionally hidden the entire time. You can have colleagues, followers, contacts, and not have a single person you can talk to honestly. Seneca would probably call that the only real kind of poverty there is, even if it's invisible on like a stat sheet. So if I had to pull the one idea out of all of this, it wouldn't really be that life is short. Seneca's actual point is more upsetting than that. Life can be plenty long and still be completely wasted. You can lose it to distraction, resentment, waiting, living according to expectations that were never really yours, to chasing a future that always stays one achievement ahead of you, no matter how close you get, to protecting your possessions while giving away the one resource that can never be replaced, your time. His answer to this, though, isn't to panic and to cram every single moment full of productive work. It's to become present enough to actually make choices about your time instead of just letting your time be taken from you. To know what genuinely deserves your attention in your life. To stop confusing being occupied with having purpose. To use adversity instead of just enduring it blankly. To treat anger as something worth examining before you let it make decisions for you. To prepare for difficulty without living through every possible disaster 100 times in your own head before it even arrives. To own things without letting those things own your attention. And finally, to remember every single day that the life that you keep planning to eventually live is actually already happening right now, whether you've noticed it or not. There might not be some perfect future moment where everything becomes clear and calm and ready. The obligations probably won't disappear, ever. The uncertainty you have probably won't ever fully resolve. The people around you might never completely understand what you're trying to build. But Seneca's whole point is that you don't actually need certainty before you start directing and taking control of your own time. You start with the hour that's right in front of you. You protect some part of it on purpose. You pay attention to where it's going. You choose what the hour is actually for. And then tomorrow, you do the exact same thing again. A meaningful life isn't built by feeling the importance of time just once in some powerful moment of enlightenment or of clarity. It's built by repeatedly refusing to give all of your time away. Thanks for listening.